Welcome back. This is Daybreak on Citizen Television. Thank you for staying with us. It's budget day, and many thanks for your company here on the broadcast. The hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. Just in a nutshell, to look at some of the key developments that will take place in the next 365 days from the 1st of July. 1.84 trillion Kenya shillings will go into debt repayment. Interest payment, 775.14 billion Kenya shillings. The principal debt redemption is 850 billion Kenya shillings. In terms of the revenue split, the national government will get 2.16 trillion Kenya shillings. Parliament, 40.4 billion Kenya shillings. The judiciary, 22.9 billion Kenya shillings. The counties will get 385 billion Kenya shillings, despite requesting to get 425 billion Kenya shillings. And the Commission on Revenue allocation, 405 billion Kenya shillings proposal, but they were allocated 385 billion Kenya shillings. The national debt, as it stands at the moment, is 9.6 trillion. The ceiling is 10 trillion Kenya shillings, therefore means the government has a headroom of 400 billion Kenya shillings to hit that. And this is in the midst of a budget deficit amounting to 720 billion Kenya shillings. And coming to you, Sandeep, talking about the amendment which was proposed in the finance bill and by the finance and national planning committee of the National Assembly, the income tax on earnings above 500,000 Kenya shillings. In terms of collection and the target there, what does it seek to raise in terms of money, and would that be, to what extent would it be enough, that collected money, to help the government in the financing of the projects that it has laid out in the next financial year?
Thanks for that, Ayub. I think first you will allow me to demystify the whole issue around this 30 or 35 or 32%. Okay. So, you know, what was the intent of this increase? We might think it's targeted towards salaried people, and I heard you mention salaried. But in my opinion, it's bigger than that. And allow me to just break it down. So if you have an employee, yes, above 500, the current proposal as it stands is 35%. Until the House has debated and agreed whether it's going to be broken down into that other two tiers is a separate conversation. 800. It could even just remain at 30%, being hopeful. But the people who are earning that 500,000 shillings and above on a monthly basis is very minimum, right? Majority of Kenyans who are salaried earn actually 100K and less. Just a very few fraction of people actually earn that 500,000 and above. But the flip side, and let me put this into perspective, if you have a company, a limited liability company that is then offering, say, for example, consultancy services or engineering services, they would pay tax at 30% because it's a company. But if you have a sole proprietor, an individual who's doing the same services would then pay tax and meets this threshold on a monthly basis would then be required, because sole proprietors and individuals pay tax on this graduated scale. So that would mean that the sole proprietor in competition with a company would pay perhaps 32 or 35%, while the company is going to pay 30%. So already it goes against the principles of taxation of equality. Why would I, as an individual, pay more than a company doing the same business, probably earning the same revenue, who pays less tax? So I think this is really the moot point here. It's not about the collections from salaried. I think the moot point here is really about sole proprietors, and we have enough businesses, we talked about it, enough businesses that are actually contributing towards this economy in terms of taxes, but now will be required to pay higher taxes than what a company offering the same services would pay. So even you talk about the medical services, doctors normally operate as sole proprietors. What does this mean for them? They have to pay more tax. If they want to compete with hospitals, they will then probably increase. So a private healthcare might go up, yet to be seen.
And that equalization is therefore what you feel is unfair?
I don't think there's equalization, because if you have...
I mean, equalization in terms of equating an individual and a sole proprietor and a company, for example.
I believe that's where the intent was, because if you look at the people who are actually earning, salaried people who earn more than 500,000, they're a handful, probably 10 or 15%, that would not have the impact the government is looking to make. But if you have businesses who are in business and in direct competition with, say, a company doing the same business, the company, mind you, will pay 30%. But the business, because it's an individual, they will have to pay tax based on these bans if they are enacted. So I think that would have an inequality. And imagine now what does this do for the economy? Because as an individual, I'm meant to contribute. The MSMEs, the hustlers of this great nation, they would end up paying more tax than an incorporated company. And incorporating a company is not a big deal. 10 days at most, or maybe 14 days, you get a company. But I can tell you the administrative tasks of running a company are higher than what you do as an individual. So I think there's a lot to be looked at, and I'm really hoping that the House reconsiders this increase so that there is equality in taxation.
Yes, Grace.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with Sandeep. And, it's not just, it's all professionals. It's the lawyers, it's the auditors, it's all consultants who sometimes, because of the nature of business, are required to register them in the form of partnerships, for example. So you really are, at the end of the day, paying individual taxes, hence the sole proprietorship. So we usually are forgetting that these tax bans don't only apply to those who are in employment, but they apply to all individuals. Any single individual who's filing a return as an individual, a sole proprietor, a consultant, etc., will need to pay the 35%. So obviously, as Sandeep has said, that's against the principles of equity in taxation.
Okay. Rispa, because I'm interested in the number, and how many Kenyans then earn between 500, let's say above 500,000 Kenya shillings? And was it wise enough for the committee in the proposal and the government to target? And if indeed this goes through, then what's the amount that the government can fetch from this, owing to the minimal number who earn more than 500,000 and above?
I may not have the exact number, but just like Sandeep has mentioned, there's just a handful of people. Not many Kenyans are in this tax bracket of 500,000 and above. So it's just few Kenyans. And looking at other proposals that go together with the finance bill that is currently under discussion, it looks like these people who are earning a little more than many other Kenyans would be hard hit in many ways, including what we're proposing as their contribution towards the housing levy or housing tax, if that's going to be a percentage and not capped, among other things. So it's not many Kenyans, really, that are in these 500,000 and above. I may not have the exact numbers as we speak. It's a fact that most Kenyans are in 150,000 and probably below. That could be like 80% of the citizens. So it's few people who will be feeling this pain. It's few people who will be hard hit on this pay-as-you-earn tax, plus many others that we're going to discuss in this breakfast show.
Okay, yes, Grace, you have a point before I come to you.
Yeah, we don't have the exact numbers, but only 2.9% of Kenyans earn more than 100,000, Bob.
2.9%.
Look at that.
Over 100,000. So by the time we get to 500,000, that must have significantly reduced. Maybe we're talking about 1% or less. The estimate that the government is hoping to collect from that is about 80 billion. Again, that's just an estimate, but there's less than 1% of Kenyans potentially who are earning more than 500,000. Yeah, because if only 2.9% are earning over 100, I don't imagine there's a significant number above 500,000.
Yes, Rispa. But then, I mean, because taxation is good, because you have to run a government. The country must exist.
It must
and the government of the day has to get money to run, and that money comes from the Kenyan people.
True.
And when you look at the raft of taxations as contained in the finance bill, Labor Day 2023, I think was the first where there were no major announcements in regards to the minimum wage increment. I mean, how then would you achieve some of these policies, and what will be the success rate when people are earning less and they are decrying taxation, about taxation, and here are proposals that again will eat into their pay slips further?
Like you rightfully say, it's a big cry from the citizens on overtaxation. I think we've talked over it, about the same issue. But again, like you rightfully say, the government has to raise revenue. And the issue currently is how much have we been borrowing versus how much have we been raising locally. And trying just to ensure that we raise this money by ourselves or locally. So the citizens may feel overtaxed at the moment, and it's coming in many forms. From, like I said, what you're earning to what you pay as you spend the same money that has been taxed at the point of earning. But at the end of the day, I think the government is looking at on-source revenue, if I may call it that way. How much can we raise on our own and just deal with this monster of the overstretched national borrowing that we have all been discussing. It has been a big issue in the past.
Yes, Onjiro.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and sometimes it sounds like a chicken and egg issue.
Yeah.
But in our analysis, when I was part of the Okoa Uchumi campaign, which is still running, looking at public debt accountability, the thing we found is that the problem was we had an expenditure problem. Because when you overestimate your expenditure vis-a-vis what you're able to raise, you must borrow. And then when you put that expenditure in places that aren't productive, you're not going to get the returns, so you must borrow again. And this is what happened over the last 10 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Government borrowed heavily, put money in investments that didn't give returns, and then borrowed expensively to pay off. So that is why we are in a hole. So the question actually we should be asking is, why do we have the expenditure problem? And is the government doing enough to cure that? So on one hand, one of the positive things that this government has done, when we looked at the trajectory of the previous administration that kept increasing the deficit, they have tried to bring down the deficit. So their increase in expenditure is less. Okay. So that in a way they are trying to be a little bit more prudent on the expenditure side. But like I said, we still have to ask the question, even if you're being more prudent in terms of the overall, are you putting this money in the right place so that it can get into sectors that have high impact? And you know, we have found in this country, high impact is where people are employed. You have to put money into agriculture. You have to put money into health. You have to put money into education, because that's where the numbers are. And we found that when government spends on these sectors, actually you have a strong multiplier effect, because you're creating jobs. You're actually making this money go round. Not saying you don't spend on infrastructure, but you then need to spend on the right types of infrastructure. So one, at the top level, there is an attempt to rationalize the expenditure, but they still, but by maintaining the same ceilings, we might see a repeat of the failings of the previous administration that didn't put enough money, for instance, in health. They're talking about universal health cover, but they haven't increased. We are spending about 6% of the budget on health. Yes. We have the Africa, the Maputo Protocol recommends it be 15%. So there's a very big gap. And as we've said, NHIF won't be able to bridge this gap unless you deal with the disconnects in NHIF. Make sure all public servants are on NHIF so that this money goes round. Make sure that it's employed, you know, very accountably. But we must also recognize that when you put 6% in healthcare, it means that even the infrastructure that's supposed to provide the health cover isn't there. It therefore means this income that is being taxed, a big chunk of this goes to subsidize the cost of healthcare, which means then your economic growth isn't there. The other point is government dealing with the structural issues that have caused us to have also prevented the economy from us being able to pay off the debt and create jobs. Because if you can't create jobs, you know, our aim isn't just to clear the debt burden. Yes, we must, but we must create jobs. And the revenue comes from job creation. This tax regime threatens to frustrate job creation. This is based on the recommendation, I think, of institutions across the board. The Parliamentary Budget Office, the World Bank this week also released the economic survey. And they say the tax regime that this government has employed has marginally increased the revenue, but it is creating sluggish growth. It is frustrating the ability of the economy to create jobs. And they caution against additional taxation. So what the government may be doing actually is inadvertently shooting itself in the foot, And the prediction of the Parliamentary Budget Office is that the tax targets are unrealistic. And because they are unrealistic, government will either have to cut some of the development projects, or fail to pay the debts, or fail to pay salaries, or they will have to borrow additionally. So in a way, this budget is standing on a weak foundation, because the amount of revenue they project to increase is unlikely to be realized.
That is by the Kenya Revenue Authority?
This is, the Parliamentary Budget Office did an analysis of the budget. Okay. They do this every year. They then create a report, which they give to Parliament to advise Parliament.
All right.
And they said the 17% increase, projected increase in taxation of revenue generation is not linked to the economic situation. They say, looking at the historical trends, taxation or the revenue generated grows in line with the vibrancy of the economy. Now, because we are coming out of a drought, because of the Ukraine, because of the global factors, because of also internal factors, our economic outlook is sluggish. And this budget says this budget is prepared in difficult economic times. And the IMF has rationalized, has reduced the projected economic growth. So if economic growth has been rationalized downwards, how are you then increasing the revenue? Where does revenue come from? It comes from economic growth. So if there's a disconnect, if you over-project revenue, it means you will have a deficit. You will have to borrow. And they will be, this hole, they said, if you have a hole, stop digging.
Digging it,
this administration is digging.
Okay.
Yes.
It's still on the same. I'll come to you, Sandeep.
They have picked the shovel and they're digging deeper.
Okay. Wanjiru, still on you. The Parliamentary Budget Office is a key component and a driver. If they advise that this is over-projection, why then will mandarins at the Treasury look the other way with regards to that report? Two, we have 9.6 trillion Kenya shillings, which you say that this over-projection will lead to borrowing, which then means that this national debt ceiling must be upscaled from 10 trillion Kenya shillings, because at the moment we only have 400 billion Kenya shillings borrowing space. Again, that responsibility comes back to Parliament, where parliamentarians sit. In terms of connecting these two, why then do you think that Treasury was dead against the report by the Parliamentary Budget Office and largely Parliament? And then two, when this issue comes before Parliament of a proposal that's likely to upscale our national debt ceiling, would Parliament consider, for example, the advice given by Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank on the consequences that will have?
Very good question, and it goes back to what you were asking about accountability and the checks and balances. The Parliamentary Budget Office has consistently been advising Parliament. They advise Parliament because in our democratic setup, Treasury, the executive makes proposals. These proposals, the executive will always try and overreach. They will always, because they're the ones who make the political pledges. So they'll always want to spend more than they can, raise more than is possible. So Parliament is our oversight mechanism. They're the ones who are supposed to tell the executive, you can't raise these taxes, raise VAT, put it on fuel, and all this battery of taxes. You cannot subject households to more pain. Parliament is supposed to be the ones who do that, not Ishongwa coming to, Honorable Ishongwa coming to justify this pain that they are saying, let households feel the pain, let us lose a few jobs, yet they themselves are not taking a pay cut. They are not, you know, their packs remain intact, and in fact, they've been trying to increase their packs while passing the pain. So the problem we have in the PFM, the way our public finance management framework is conceptualized, is Parliament. Parliament has been in the pocket of the executive. So whereas the PBO has been making recommendations since the word go, in fact, since we started the debt spree under the Jubilee, the Uhuru Ruto administration, And then from 2017, PBO has consistently been talking about unrealistic revenue projections. And it's consistently been saying this is going to push us into debt. And they've used quite strong language, but Parliament ignores its own advisory because our Parliament is not independent. Our Parliament is not working as it ought. And we need to recognize that we have a problem in our democracy in that we have active citizen engagement.
All right.
Citizens have given their views. What are the instruments we have to compel Parliament to comply? Should we be recalling parliamentarians? What is the process of recall? What is the power of petition? So we are having public participation that is vibrant, but it's tokenistic because the tools to enforce are weak. And then when it comes to the Treasury, there's been discussion about the lack of independence of the Treasury, because the Treasury is supposed to advise governments and is supposed to generate proposals in the best interest of the country. But we've seen the Treasury has become really just an arm of the presidency. Okay. When it comes to the debt ceiling, yes, we can expect that Parliament will have a proposal to increase the debt ceiling. And if the way they have voted on this budget is any indication to go by, the president is going to have a walkover. So actually, the question you're asking is where are the checks and balances, and is our democracy really working for us, or are we simply going through a lot of motions and getting out the same result? At present, we are totally reliant on the goodwill of the executive and the few positive proposals in this budget because our Parliament is largely missing in action.
Sandeep, that's now the PBO Parliament over projection, as Wanjiru says. Two questions. Does this then place the Kenya Revenue Authority, which has to collect those taxes or revenues, at crossroads? One. Two, I mean, does that then become the major reason or the prompting factor which has over time informed under collection by KRA over what it intends to collect and why it falls below that target when it comes to the conclusive outcomes of now putting into book what it had collected from the Kenyan people as revenues?
You know, I think, and thanks for that, Ayub. I think Wanjiru has really talked a lot about accountability, you know, and building trust within, you know, the public. So I think for me, it's going to be a tall order for the Kenya Revenue Authority to implement and to collect. So what happens is that when there's an increase in tax, and maybe Grace, you can also attest to this, when there is an increase in tax, it's done instantly in iTax. You know, you'll see when, if you recall, during the pandemic, when the tax rates were reduced, it took a long time. We had challenges filing returns, there were inconsistencies. We had to wait even past the deadline in some instances to make the filings because we had reduced the tax rate from 30 to 25 at that point in time for both companies and individuals. But the minute that was reverted to 30%, that change was done immediately. So putting that into perspective is that I think if these taxes come into play, the changes will be done almost immediately, right? But the issue of collection would now be what she's saying, is the economy, are the taxpayers ready to fork out additional taxes? I think that's where the challenge is going to be. Do you have enough? You cannot give what you do not have. I think that's the challenge. Most taxpayers are struggling with you know, meeting end-to-end you know, their basic needs. And I think the economic survey of 2023 talked about the value of 1,000 shillings. 2 years ago, let's not talk about 10 years ago, just 2 years ago, the 1,000 shillings had value. I could buy unga, you know, sugar and basic commodities, at least enough. But today, the same 1,000 shillings has no value, right? Basic minimum that even a low-income earner has to spend at supermarkets would probably be about 5K, which is a lot. Someone earning maybe that 24,000. So yes, I think from a revenue authority perspective, in terms of collections, once they implement, if this do pass, and I hope some don't, it would be an instant, you know, automation, instant increase, instant update of these tax rates within iTax. But the challenge is now, are taxpayers going to declare? Are taxpayers going to pay? Are businesses going to be wound up? That is the challenge.
Okay. And with the under collection then, is this a pressure that comes because of ignoring reports which are very key, like the Parliamentary Budget Office, which then, according to many analysts and economic observers and the consensus largely, informs the aggressive policy by the KRA to meet that target. Because once it comes from Treasury, then to Parliament, it's passed or adopted, then it's the responsibility of KRA. Does then that inform the aggressive policies that KRA had embarked on in making sure that they meet this target? But you look at the books, after all, they are still falling short of what they intend to collect.
Remember how this works is that National Treasury sets the government sets the budget. National Treasury has the budget. Kenya Revenue Authority is a collecting agent. We must understand. Policies are not set by Revenue Authority. They are just there to implement and to collect. So some of these discussions are probably beyond their control. But I must say, Kenya Revenue Authority too has a role to play when it comes to policy setting. They do make recommendations, right, to their bosses, the National Treasury, on how things should work or could work. I think the challenge here is, in any company, you could have a budget, but then you must actually say what you have actually achieved at the end of the year or every quarter. And that is what is currently happening. I had a budget, I have not achieved it, or I have surpassed it. Some of the things that the government has done is amnesties. We cannot meet our budget without granting amnesties. The voluntary tax disclosure program, it's ending this year, right? But in the first year it was introduced where they said that 100% waiver of interest and penalties if you self-declare, pay the principal tax. Do you know they met their target in that year? Today, this year, it's a final year, and I think you only get 25% waivers. But what is the finance bill proposed? And we're not talking about it. One of the proposals in the finance bill is an amnesty for historical taxes paid. If you have not paid, settle. If you have paid up to 31st December 2022, and you have, I think, up to June 2024, to remit principal taxes, and you get the waivers. Historical waivers. Today, from where I sit, we have a number of taxpayers who have issues within iTax. They have paid the principal tax, but there's an interest and penalty sitting in iTax, which then does not allow them to get a tax compliance certificate. Because as far as KRA is concerned, if you have any liability, whether it's interest or penalties, although you have paid the principal, you cannot get a TCC, tax compliance certificate. Although that's a discussion you can have. But I think my challenge here is that going forward, we talk about how Revenue Authority is going to be an enabler in financing the budget. If going forward, that bill proposes that that provision for applying for waiver goes. So after 2024, even if you make an honest mistake, an honest mistake, right? We are human, we can make mistakes. Can you believe that you pay total principal plus interest plus penalties? Assume your principal tax is 100 million and assume, taking into consideration the induplum. Induplum means that the interest and penalties cannot exceed principal, another 100 million. A business or a taxpayer will have to pay 200 million. Do you not think they'll meet their target?
All right. Let's now respond. Grace, I'll come to you. Sample the feedback from our viewers as well and take some of the questions therein as we welcome further contributions, views and opinions here on the broadcast on Budget Day. And this is what you're saying on the hashtag Twitter. Daybreak, the SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. This coming from Sir Nixon Dugure says, even though the Constitution bestows sovereign power to the people, what should people do? The government misappropriate all the budget money apart from waiting for the general elections to throw the cut, usually untouchable offenders in brackets, he says. Okelo Mwalimu says, today I choose to congratulate MPs who stood with us by opposing the punitive tax regime contained in the finance bill. Even though they did not succeed, they must be urged to stay put. Still, he says, I sympathize with my countrymen and women who believe that the finance bill will make their lives better. However, I have some news for them. 1st July, when the effects of the bill will be felt, isn't far away. Everyone must fasten his or her belt. The Kenya Kwanza tax regime flight is on. Honorable Lillian Sioi says, we cannot tolerate mediocrity forever. We'll call out the MPs who never showed up in the Kenyan Parliament to vote the Finance Bill 2023. The nation is rising up. Remy Butia says the Ruto administration intends to support the agro-processing and value addition to agriculture exports. This is a good step since almost a quarter of the GDP comes from the agriculture sector. The budget is a good start, but it has to be implemented. Engineer Lazaro says the national government retains huge chunks of the budget allocation and still no clear mechanism for sealing corruption loopholes. Regime only retains the status quo. Bob Otieno Owino says budget 2023 is a good move, but accountability deceit is a big headache and the biggest worries of Kenyans because of the experiences they have witnessed, how their monies got lost via corruption in other institutions. Asamo_ says the issue is not borrowing. The tragedy is corruption. Audited reports show a third of the budget is lost to corruption. Now calculate a percentage of 4.4 trillion financial year 2023-24 budget. Kenya's issue is expenditure. Gode Barasawere says, in my view, half of the budgetary allocation to the national government should have been injected in devolved units because many of the key functions are already devolved to the counties. Yes, Rispa, you had a point, or Grace?
This is a general point as we continue on the discussion. Yeah. I think it's clear from what we've had that accountability is the biggest issue here. The budget is a good start point, as some of the audience have actually stated. And I'm glad that this is the first time probably that we are having discussion of what our budget is and where the money is coming from. Because previously or many times we end up passing a budget and then, you know, the shock on us. People or the citizens are not quite aware or familiar with where the money is going to come from for this. And the borrowing, the public debt that we've all been talking about. So for me, there are wins in this budget. That has been, like has been mentioned. Yeah. One is on trying to raise revenue locally to ensure that we meet the budget deficit, limit on the borrowing, or probably we minimize and not focus too much on external borrowing or borrowing to meet the budget. And it's just my hope, really, as I had indicated earlier, and the President assured us that there's going to be a difference. Yeah. We are looking forward to that. Of course, the CS, I think it's yesterday that he was mentioning that this is a perfect, a budget in a perfect storm. So it's not like the government is not aware of these pain points and what it is that we've been through. I think Wanjiko had alluded to some of those, the Ukraine war, COVID, drought, and many others. Yet life has to go on. And for any rational Kenyan, it wouldn't be, I mean, we'd all be okay with paying or giving the money, so long as we get the services, so long as we see and know where our money go, and we're able to receive these services. And yeah, the monster of corruption that we're all talking about is dealt with.
Yes, Grace. In response to the feedback before we proceed, many objections raised, of course, for example, the sector allocations done by the government, but then they say prudence must be the accompanying factor. We have talked about accountability issues and the GDP contribution, for example, by agriculture, which we'll talk about by extension because I have a breakdown on the super wall. But what's your take on the feedback sent in by the viewers in regards to the concerns that they have about the budget?
I think the concerns are legitimate, really. So we definitely do have some wins, but we have the not so good proposals, and we hope that those will change by the end of June. And, you know, the question, even as you were asking about the pressure on the Revenue Authority, so as it stands right now, the Revenue Authority will potentially not meet its targets for the last financial year. But then we're increasing the targets for the next year amidst all these challenges that we're facing. The question is, again, have we analyzed where we intend to raise the additional, because we're not meeting this year, what's a plan to raise the additional budget that we're now imposing on the Revenue Authority for collection? And then number two, question is, why have we also not met the targets? Are we already having businesses that are too squeezed? Are we having individuals who've lost employment? Are we having businesses that are not thriving? What can we do to create an enabling environment? You know, we've spoken about agriculture and education and health. But are we also looking at manufacturing? Are we looking at export of services? At least as also a good proposal. I think the chair to the Parliamentary Committee on the Finance, he mentioned that export of services will now be reverted back to zero rated. So hopefully that will give us, you know, a leeway as an international financial center to grow business for Kenyans. So I think at the bottom line, it's collections are mandatory, but services are mandatory for all of us, not just for the hustlers, as it were. So each of us needs to get a service from the government. And we would be happy to pay, you know, for the taxes that we need to pay. The thing is, we pay for our roads. You know, within the small areas that we live in, we are paying for education. We are paying for water. We are paying for electricity. We are buying solar. We are paying for medical services. So we have NHIF and we still have our private covers. And like I mentioned earlier, once the 2.75% of NHIF is implemented, we will be contributing way higher than what we actually contribute to the private medical insurance schemes. So, you know, what will happen? Are we still going to, are we going to get the same quality of medical services if we only contribute to NHIF? And does that then mean we don't contribute to
the private insurance,
services, for the private insurance services? Yes.
Okay. Yes, Rispa, please proceed.
I have just a small add, because like we've seen from the citizens, there's a lot of push and pull on who passed the bill or who voted for and who didn't vote for. I think at the end of the day, the big confusion here is that the bill will go full circle. My biggest concern or prayer is that the citizens or the proposals that have been made will have been heard. Of course, they may not be taken 100%, but I also don't expect the bill to pass as is. So at some point, we hope to get feedback that the proposals that have come forth, I think we had over 1,500 submissions on this particular bill. I'm just hoping that somebody will take time to listen to the citizens, and we will have a bill passed, that an act at the end of the day that will help us run and manage this budget, and hopefully incorporating feedback that we've received from the Kenyan, because their voice has been loud, and it's my prayer that the voice has been heard.
Okay. Well, Wanjiru, can I come to you as you also make your point? Because you all pointed out three key critical sectors: agriculture, healthcare, and education. And looking at a report, and this is one at a time, starting off with agriculture, by the National Assembly Committee on Environment and Natural Resources, tabled in the House in 2019 for the financial years 2016-17 and 17-18, the National Treasury released 120 billion to fund the construction of dams across the country, none of which saw the light of day. Now, that money, if you break it down mathematically, it then means that we have lost 5 billion Kenya shillings a month, 1.7 Kenya shillings, 1.7 billion every day, and 70 million Kenya shillings, which disappeared every single hour under the Jubilee government, agriculture. Then that coupled with the Galana Kulalo project, in which the private Israeli company pulled out, citing frustrations from government officials, to which President William Ruto acknowledged when he took over power and saying, we will revive this project, is partly because of corruption that it collapsed. Healthcare, KEMSA scandal during the Jubilee government and recently, and the president had taken an action. You have the other scandals around healthcare in the country. Education, reforms needed, the president's task force on education, that is the presidential task force on education reforms. These are the three critical components, yet they are facing turbulence on overtime in the previous regimes. Will President Ruto, as he has shown the goodwill, be in a position to address some of the challenges I've highlighted, specifically facing the specific areas of agriculture, healthcare, and education, in order to overcome the challenges facing the Kenyan people?
Right. Again, another loaded question, but a very important one, because obviously President Ruto campaigned on a platform of transforming agriculture. And health is also another of the transformative sectors to kind of the diagnosis of the Kenya Kwanza in the manifesto. They correctly recognize that there are structural impediments, that our economy is locked because of these historical kind of structures. And his campaign promise was to restructure them. So what are they doing in dealing with the structural issues is what you're asking. Because there is the structural issues and then there is the governance and corruption. Yeah. So on the structural side, there is an attempt, you know, to give credit where it's due. Because they are focusing on MSMEs. So there is the fund to MSMEs. There is a program actually directed at the MSMEs. There is also the value chain program, which is really opening up these value chains so that those along the value chain can benefit from it and those benefits can spread to the lowest level. The question that the Parliamentary Budget Office asks about these initiatives is it enough? Because we don't know what it takes to actually restructure a value chain to deal with the MSMEs. Even the Uhuru administration had money for the MSMEs, but it wasn't enough. So is it enough? But so there is a plus there, but the quantum is still, like I said, the overall ceilings haven't changed. We expected to see a budget that would really put agriculture at the center stage, would put money into cooperatives. So the cooperative ministry that would put money, you know, have a conditional grant maybe to the county governments on agriculture. They haven't done that. So it seems like there's a lot of business as usual. Oh, let's keep the big items on energy, infrastructure, you know, maintain that budget because we must get some money for the wazares, but then let's give something to make the promises go ahead. That's what it looks like. When you look at the governance side of it, when you look at the dams, especially the dams really showed very well the failure of the administration, one, to restructure the state-owned enterprises because I think it was Kirio Valley Authority that orchestrated this, this scheme and did the borrowing was supposed to have been wound up if you look at the parastatal report of the Presidential Task Force. So when we talk about state-owned enterprises and debt even, a lot of the debt has been acquired by these state-owned enterprises because there is an accountability deficit. Now, as the government seeks to restructure state-owned enterprises, he has locked out the public, he has locked out Parliament. So we can expect more of the same. Actually, what it looks like, I mean, people have said we're looking at a situation like what happened in Russia. When you're selling off public assets behind a veil, you're actually going to sell those assets to our political leaders. So the dynasty is being replaced by the hustler lords because they are working in secret. That's what we can surmise. So on one hand, there is an attempt to deal with the structural issues. Okay. But the governance side is still a major gap. There is this infrastructure framework that the Treasury mooted because they recognize that the way government was administrating projects was not working. There was too much corruption, whether it's in PPPs, whether it's in the procurement process. So there's a framework to ensure that projects are administered correctly. Looking at this budget, some of the proposals around which are the ongoing projects, can we have that information? There is a beginning attempt by Parliament to by Treasury to give that information to Parliament. But that framework needs to be open. We need to say, look, we have corruption in infrastructure. From the origin of the project to the implementation. We need full transparency. We need proactive disclosure. In fact, when government signed the fiscal consolidation program of IMF, these transparencies around the projects was some of the conditions that we got the money on. But then government did not give that information. And when they give that information, they don't go into enough detail. So no, the framework for accountability has not been set up. Right now, actually, we are just relying on the goodwill of those who are sitting in these offices, not to steal us blind.
Thank you.
And maybe the last point is, we also are not getting implementation reports. We are focusing here on the budget, which is prioritization, which is the planning stage of the budget. But after implementation or during implementation, the oversight, And after implementation, the reporting, there is no scrutiny there. There's not enough money with the Auditor General. The Auditor General has proposed a citizen audit mechanism, hasn't been operationalized. So the transparency in the implementation and oversight, not there.
Thank you. Talking about this, Sandeep, coming to you, the question on expenditure, the austerity that was called for by the government and largely which applies in many economies. What significance can this bear in terms of the government also, despite wanting to raise the revenues as it has projected now, saying that we need to end borrowing, that culture, raise our revenues. Also, how would they prioritize expenditure and excesses in government, for example, and ensure that they adhere to the austerity that they have announced for government officials to save some coins from the government?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ayub. And I think what Wanjiru has talked about in terms of transparency, accountability, credibility plays a role when you're talking about expenditure. And when we talk about expenditure, even when an individual has lost a job or a business is not doing well or a company is not doing well, they would then try and manage, as they look for additional revenue, they would try and manage their expenditure. Would that be maintaining salaries of employees? Would that be, reducing on any other OPEX, or, that could be related, moving to, offices that are, cheaper in terms of rent and whatnot. And probably even looking towards green energy to save on the KPLC bills. But that's a conversation for a different day. So I think for us, that's how companies are using governance to measure their expenditure, to see if we are not doing well as a business. And I'll bring this why I'm talking about a business first, is that if I'm not doing well as a business, then I must manage my revenue, my expenditure, and I must prioritize. What is the most important thing for me to sustain my business into the future is what businesses look at. Looking at it from a government perspective. So we have all these expenditure, all these allocations that they have talked about, but what is priority for GOK? We talked about health, we talked about education, we're saying not enough for health. Grace has really spoken about NHIF a lot, and obviously we've talked about education a lot. So where is the focus of the government? So when you look at, it's not about, and I've seen a lot about comments about, tightening your belt. It's also the government to tighten its belt. We must have that very clearly. So what are the expenditures that the government should then focus on, to then drive this country, drive the economy into the future? And yes, manufacturing, agriculture is key priority. What are we doing in that sector? So I think for me, when you're looking at expenditure, you're looking at it end to end. And I think what Rispa talked about is, where are you spending money and what is your return? If we spend money in the agricultural sector, we expect a better return in terms of exports, perhaps even reduce food prices, right? So I think that is where we need to talk about prioritizing expenditure, and how you do it is now really looking at where's your highest return.
Grace and Rispa, I'll take your account when we get back from the break, and I'll proceed because we have to look at now agriculture, which the president, when he launched his manifesto, not necessarily reading from the autocue, had expressed himself off the cuff because of the passion he had for farmers in the country, who said there's need for value addition, there's need to look into the welfare of our farmers across the country and make the country resource mobilized, export-oriented economy. You look at coffee, you look at tea, consumption rate highest in Asia and parts of Europe. But back home, the farmers are in a state of despair and need to be addressed. Talk about also the counties, talk about the debt repayment, because that is also an obligation that the country has. And Eurobond, which is coming up for next year, that is in about a year's time. And the international market and the eyes with which Kenya is viewed. The hashtag is Daybreak, the SMS code 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. When we get back from the break, the discussion continues. It's Budget Day, a special coverage here on Citizen TV. Stay tuned.